Leith Van Onselen is the chief economist at the MB Fund and MB Super and co-founder of Macro Business, and he is a contributor to this program. Good morning, Leith. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, g'day, Mike. How's things?
Yeah, not too bad. It's interesting to me, although I suppose I'm stating the obvious, that when it suits the ruling cabal, whatever they are, they want the mob, as Graham Richardson used to refer to them, to keep quiet, be nice, play nice, and get on. However, when it suits that same cabal, they're quite happy to create a division, which is what they seem to be doing with, what does Albo call it? Putting a lens, an intergenerational lens on policy development, which seems to be taking advantage of the idea that somehow or other the older folks had it really good and the younger folks are missing out because of it.
Yeah, that's a pretty nice summary, I think. Australia does have issues, obviously, intergenerational and budgetary and all these sorts of things. And, a lot of that's due to stupid government policy, to be quite frank. So, but, we've obviously got a governments across state, federal, whatever, that waste money, right? So we've got, if you look at the federal government level, they're basically spending a record amounts of money. If you look at the public demand as a share of GDP, which is basically the public services share of the GDP, it's about 29%, which is a historical high.
Really?
And we're seeing, yeah, absolutely. We're seeing massive expenditure across all sorts of things. About 80% of the jobs growth in the last couple of years has actually been in the non-market sector, which is basically government-funded jobs.
Yes.
And obviously we've got, a blowout in bureaucracy, public servants and the like across the state and federal bureaucracies. I'd argue that we need to cut those right back, and they should be putting more focus in the frontline services like, actual, fireys, police, nurses, that sort of thing, rather than back office bureaucrats, which is what we've got.
Yeah.
But structurally speaking, Australia does have a lot of issues with its finances. So, we have a tax system that is ridiculously reliant on personal income taxes, and that obviously hurts working Australians. So the one area of the tax system that is growing very quickly is personal income taxes.
Yep.
And there's two reasons for that. First of all, we've got an ageing population. So we've got a smaller share of workers in the economy supporting everyone else. And secondly, we've got a tax system that is basically doesn't tax the right things, and the other things that it does tax are actually shrinking as a share of total tax revenue. So, for example, the GST actually is shrinking as a share of the economy because it excludes the highest spending areas of the economy like health and education, those sorts of things. And as well, other areas of the federal budget, which traditionally have raised, many billions of dollars, are actually shrinking as well. So, for example, tobacco excise. The federal government's, taxing cigarettes at $2 a dart. As a result, people are going towards the black market. They're no longer buying cigarettes officially because it's about $60 a carton or $80 a carton, whatever it is. And that's bleeding billions and billions of dollars from federal government tax revenues. It's the same with fuel excise. The government's trying to force us into electric vehicles. People are buying hybrids. As a result, the federal government's collecting, tens of billions of dollars over the forward estimates less in fuel excise. That's drained the federal budget. So we've effectively got this tax system that is basically the only area that's growing is personal income taxes. And that's bad if you care about intergenerational equity because it's obviously young people that are working and they're getting taxed a much higher percentage of their income, and that percentage of income that gets taxed will continue to go up with bracket creep. So what we need to do, we do need to broaden the tax base. And the way you do that is you can, for example, put up the GST. You can tax wealth more. You can, shift to other areas. What I'd like to see, Mike, is actually the federal government tax our resources better. So, we should be copying Norway. So Norway is sitting on a 300, basically a sovereign wealth fund that is absolutely ginormous, which it has created on the back of its oil and gas exports.
Right.
So Norway was smart. They, many decades ago, they set up a sovereign wealth fund that basically taxes oil and gas exports at about 80%. And they got government-owned, entities that work in that area as well. And as a result, they raised a whole bunch of money, which they then invested into a massive pension fund that invests overseas. They're the biggest owners of Microsoft and all these other companies. And that sovereign wealth fund is now worth $300,000 US per resident in Norway.
Right.
And there's no reason why Australia couldn't have done something like that, or could still do, not necessarily sovereign wealth fund, but tax our resources better. We are the biggest iron ore exporter in the world. We're the biggest coal exporter in the world. We are the second biggest gas exporter. We're sitting on loads of uranium, loads of nickel, manganese, cobalt, all these things that go into batteries and, rare earths and all these sorts of things. We have everything the world needs other than oil. And because of that, we should be incredibly rich nation. We shouldn't have budget deficits, because if we tax this stuff properly, we can literally raise all the revenue you need. And we wouldn't be having these stupid debates. But, unfortunately, we don't do those things. And as a result, we end up having these debates about, intergenerational this, intergenerational that sort of thing. And look, I will admit, I don't think we tax property correctly. Like I think it's a little bit too generous on the capital gains tax concession and all that sort of thing. And that's obviously added a little bit to our housing unaffordability. And we could probably do that a little bit better. We probably should tax superannuation more fairly, because it is a bit of a tax dodge the way it's set up. But I don't agree with the way that the federal government's going about it. We shouldn't be taxing unrealised superannuation gains. That is incredibly complicated. It's introducing a whole new area of taxation that we've never done before. And instead of doing something like that, we could instead just raise the tax on earnings of superannuation, which is currently 15%, just raise it to 30% for high super balances. And that way you don't change the way it's taxed, you just increase the tax amount. I think the superannuation industry believes that's a good idea, but instead the federal government wants to do a completely stupid idea and starting to tax unrealised super gains, which just basically means you're taxing paper profits, which haven't been realised yet, which I think is just the wrong way to go about it.
Just on that, Leith, just on the unrealised gains, what if the unrealised gains turn out to be losses instead? Does that mean flocks of lawyers will then start having a go at the government saying, okay, you wanted us to pay before we saw the profits. Now that we've seen losses, you pay our clients?
Well, yeah, you'd think so. Or alternatively, what they'll probably do is they'll take the money off you and then they'll give you like a credit for future gains. Okay. And one crazy thing about it is it'll start from a certain date, right? So, for example, assume it starts from 1 July next year. If you got a share portfolio that's actually down before you go into that 1 July is the start date. So, for example, if you had a share portfolio that's lost 20%, 1 July next year, say it then goes up 10%, and I'm assuming you're someone who's holding more than $3 million in super, which is what they're talking about. If from after that 10% gain, you'll be taxed on that 10%, but you've already lost 20%. So there's all these, little anomalies that are just stupid. And what they should really do is they should just, increase the tax on earnings and realised profits, which is what they currently do. Those things are currently taxed at 15%. Just double it to 30% for high income, for people with huge balances. And you just tax the second 15% the same way as tax the first 15%. So it's not complicated. You're not creating a whole new system. You're not creating a whole, bunch of complexity in the system. And, I believe the superannuation industry actually supports that approach.
Right.
So they're not against doing something like that. And you could do that and you would make the superannuation system more equitable. And you'd also raise more money for the federal budget. And that's the sort of things they should be looking at. Not this, stupid things like unrealised super gains and what have you. And, again, as I just said before, Mike, we should be taxing our resources properly. Like, we have everything the world needs. We've got an abundance of resources. We sell loads of this stuff to the rest of the world, but we don't tax it properly. And it's kind of crazy that, we've got a country of 27.7 million people sitting on this enormous wealth, but we don't get enough from that wealth. And then we sit here worrying about how we're going to balance the budget. But we shouldn't really be having those problems. And countries like Norway don't have those problems because they're smart, or Qatar. Qatar raises tens of billions of dollars every year from its gas exports. And they're the third biggest gas exporter. We're the second biggest gas exporter. We raise hardly anything. Why aren't we doing what Qatar does? Why aren't we doing what Norway does? It's crazy.
I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that the politicians think that the mass of the people in this country are just another resource, and their duty always lies elsewhere, overseas, whatever.
Yeah, and it does create other distortions, Mike, because because the personal income taxes are the fastest growing area of taxation, right?
Yeah.
Because it goes up every year with bracket creep.
Yeah,
So
yeah. And that works against aspiration. Here's Susan Lee saying, oh, I'm going to reduce the culture of dependency. I mean, I could pretend that I think she means the culture of government depending on income tax, but I'm sure what she really means is people dependent on government for existence. But how, Susan?
Yeah, and look, it does also create other distortions. So, for example, one of the reasons why the federal government loves running a high immigration program, an exceptionally large immigration program, is because the federal government collects 80% of the nation's tax revenue.
Yes,
and it collects it primarily through personal income taxes and also company taxes. And if you import hundreds of thousands of extra people into the country every year, and most of those people work, well, the federal budget sees that as a way to the federal government sees that as a way just to basically backstop the budget, because all that extra personal income taxes goes to the feds, right? So they see high immigration as a way to save the federal budget. The problem is they only look at it in that narrow lens, and they don't consider the fact that when you have hundreds of thousands of extra people coming to the country every year, they need infrastructure services, all these sorts of things, and those things primarily fall on the states, right?
Yeah.
So the federal government sees it as a one-way bet for them, but then they defer the costs onto the states. They defer the costs, which then defer the costs onto us, because the state governments sell off everything because they need to quickly raise money to try and build more stuff and whatever. They end up privatising everything. Instead of building the old-fashioned roads, now everything's a toll road, which basically means that if you live in Sydney now, you can't drive around without having to pay Transurban money, which is basically a private tax.
We've got more toll roads per square, whatever it is, than any other city, as I understand it, and the tolls themselves are extremely high. And when it comes to numbers versus resources, when Bob Carr was Premier, whenever that was, a fair while ago, he said then Sydney is full, but we're still doing the same things.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is foisted upon us by the federal government, right? The federal government goes, okay, beauty, we'll grow the population by 13.5 million people in the next 40 years, which is the official projection. That's equivalent to another Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, that's going to create problems for the housing market, which is going to hurt the young people, right? It's going to push up rents. It's going to push up prices. It's going to make everyone live in shoeboxes.
People.
That's right. And then at the same time, though, Mike, it means that if you're in Sydney, and at the turn of the century at the Sydney Olympics, you had only 2 toll roads, if you count the Sydney Harbour Bridge and Tunnel as one. Now you've got about over a dozen, right? And the reason why you have over a dozen is because Sydney's grown by 1.5 million people. You're landlocked. They've had to build tunnels everywhere. But now you're paying tolls to get from A to B, when previously you could just drive without tolls with less congestion.
But it's not just Sydney. I was reading about the congestion on the Gold Coast now, for example.
Oh, everywhere, mate. It's everywhere. Sydney's probably the most egregious because Sydney has the most toll roads. But
yes,
but these are the sorts of issues which are always glossed over, right? So instead of saying, oh look, young people, poor young people have got it tough, we've got to blame the oldies.
Yeah.
Well, how about the federal government looks inwardly and says, hang on, we've grown Australia's population by 8.7 million people since the turn of the century in the last just over 25 years.
Yeah.
That has put unbelievable pressure on rents, on house prices, and that's meant that young people can no longer afford housing. Well, maybe we shouldn't do that anymore. But instead they go, you know what, we're just going to attack older people who bought before we did these stupid things. And, it's not very, it's not addressing the underlying causes of these things.
It's not very productive. And I thought we were supposed to be all about productivity. Yes. Right. Leith, I do appreciate your time and comments as always. Thank you very much for coming on the program.
No worries, Mike, anytime.
Okay, Leith Van Onselen there. Leith's Chief Economist at the MB Fund and MB Super and co-founder of Macro Business.